Photos capture how Bernie Sanders went from being a working-class kid in Brooklyn to a top 2020 Democratic presidential candidate. Sanders was born on September 8, 1941 in a working-class neighborhood in Brooklyn. His father was a Jewish paint salesman who immigrated from Poland while his mother was a homemaker raised in New York. Sanders grew up in a small, rent-controlled apartment in Brooklyn. He played in the streets, attended Hebrew school, and liked to frequent Chinese and Jewish delis. Sanders said his family struggled to make ends meet throughout his childhood. It wasn't a question of putting food on the table. It was a question of arguing about whether you buy this or whether you buy that. You know, families do this. I remember a great argument about drapes, whether we could afford them, he said. After his mother died, Sanders studied for a year at Brooklyn College and soon wound up at the University of Chicago. He threw himself into protests for the desegregation of Chicago public schools and led a sit-in on campus aimed at integrating university housing. He was once arrested for his activism. Through the 1970s, Sanders ran 4 failed campaigns on Vermont's anti-war Liberty Union Party, twice for senator and twice for governor. But in 1980, he won the mayoral race in Burlington, Vermont, as an independent by only 10 votes. Sanders transformed Burlington into a bastion of progressivism and left-wing activism. He oversaw a period of economic growth, and also established an arts council, women's commission, and a youth office. The Burlington mayor also added a diplomatic layer to his municipal duties. He traveled to Nicaragua, the Soviet Union, and Cuba to forge closer links with leftist governments. In the winter of 1987, Sanders recorded We Shall Overcome, a folk album with a message of peace, justice, and human rights. A year later, Sanders married Jane O'Meara, who was director of Burlington's youth programs at the time. He asked me to dance, and we've been together ever since, O'Meara Sanders said. She is now his closest advisor. Sanders was first elected to the House in 1990 as a socialist candidate. He ran on a platform of slamming more taxes on the rich and slashing military spending, and won by a hefty 17-point margin. In 1991, Sanders was one of the founding members and the first chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. It had 6 members then, but it's now ballooned to 96 lawmakers. But Sanders initially struggled landing prestigious committee assignments given his nonpartisan affiliation as an independent and his outspoken progressive ideals. Sanders didn't make many friends early on in Congress. He once said he wouldn't mind if 80% of its members lost their re-election bids and described Congress as impotent. In the House, Sanders developed a reputation for being an outsider, opting to chart his own path rather than compromise. He opposed the North American Free Trade Agreement and voted against the Brady Bill 5 times, a pro-gun control piece of legislation. Sanders repeatedly grilled Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan at House Financial Services Committee hearings. Sanders twice pushed to pass legislation to allow the importation of cheaper prescription drugs. It failed both times in the early 2000s. He later said about Congress, "Nobody knows how this place is run. If they did, they'd go nuts." In 2006, Sanders won his Senate campaign by a whopping 33-point margin and started caucusing with Democrats. During the financial crisis, Sanders tried blocking the renomination of Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke, saying he was an architect of the Bush economy who had sunk the nation into a recession. As the Affordable Care Act was being debated, Sanders viewed it as a pathetic alternative to the federally funded single-payer healthcare system he championed for decades. But Senate Democrats brought him on board as a step in the right direction. After former President Barack Obama made a deal with Republicans to extend the Bush-era tax cuts in 2010, Sanders ripped into the agreement with an 8-hour filibuster-style speech. The defiant gesture energized progressives, and he turned the speech into a book. Sanders worked with Senator John McCain on bipartisan legislation in 2014 to reform medical care for veterans. It infused $5 billion in more funding for the Department of Veteran Affairs to hire new medical staff, and made it easier for veterans to seek care outside the system as well as to fire inept VA employees. Sanders first ran for president in 2015 on a platform of economic populism, seeking to tax the rich, rein in big banks, and champion Medicare for all. His insurgent campaign against Democratic frontrunner Hillary Clinton lasted well into 2016, and he 23 won primary races. During the 2016 presidential primary race, Sanders gained more of the youth vote than both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump combined. After Trump was elected president, Sanders fought to defend Obamacare from being gutted by Republicans. And he continued staging events around the country to spread his progressive message, particularly in rural areas where he believed Democrats failed to make enough inroads in 2016. Sanders announced his second presidential campaign in February 2019. But his anti-establishment appeal was tested as Sanders entered a crowded Democratic primary where other candidates also embraced a $15 minimum wage, universal health care, and tuition-free college. Senator Elizabeth Warren emerged as one of his main rivals. Just 10 hours after announcing his candidacy, Sanders received $4 million from nearly 150,000 individual donors. Sanders sought early on to quell concerns over past stumbles on racial issues and reports of sexism and other harassment in his 2016 campaign. Yet he became the primary frontrunner, again relying on a similar coalition of young voters and working-class voters that powered his previous run with a torrent of online donations. Sanders traveled to Canada just before the first Democratic debate in June to point out the skyrocketing cost of insulin and other prescription drugs in America and how much lower prices were just over the northern border. Canada's comprehensive universal healthcare system has invited comparisons to Medicare for All in the U.S. Healthcare is a key area of debate in the primary. The Sanders Medicare for All plan would ensure every American with comprehensive health insurance paid for by the government and essentially get rid of private coverage. At the July Democratic debate, Sanders defended his signature Medicare for All proposal against attacks from moderate candidates who accused him of not knowing whether it would cover every health care need. "I do know it," he said. "I wrote the damn bill." Sanders has aligned his presidential campaign with the legacies of Franklin D. Roosevelt and Martin Luther King, Jr. He called for a 21st-century economic Bill of Rights to address varying aspects of American life in healthcare, the environment, wages, education, affordable housing, and the environment. The 78-year-old Sanders suffered a heart attack in October, heightening scrutiny around age in the Democratic primary. His campaign canceled events for the week and he was admitted to a hospital for 2 days. "See you soon on the campaign trail," he said in a video posted on Twitter. Some believed the Sanders campaign was irreparably harmed as a result of the senator's heart attack. But the candidate bounced back at a New York City campaign rally and scored an endorsement from Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a major progressive figure. AOC and Sanders campaigned together in Iowa, bringing their message of political revolution to a state where the Vermont senator was rebooting his campaign. In February, Sanders claimed victory in the first 3 voting states, Iowa, New Hampshire, and Nevada, putting him in the lead as the national frontrunner. But Joe Biden jumped ahead on Super Tuesday, after sweeping the vote in 10 out of the 14 states up for grabs. Biden won the delegate-rich state of Texas, but Sanders is projected to take home the biggest prize, California. Super Tuesday put Sanders slightly behind Biden in the delegate count. Biden saw a strong victory among Southern and older black voters, while Sanders saw success among young people and Latinos. In an attempt to halt Sanders in the primaries, former Democratic candidates Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, and Michael Bloomberg have dropped out of the race and endorsed Biden. Insider polling suggests that Sanders is viewed as the most left-leaning candidate in the field, and the second most qualified after Biden. After Super Tuesday, there are still 131 days until the Democratic National Convention, and 244 days until Election Day.